This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
That conflict involved state-sponsored iconography and different forms of popular expression. In this way, I analyze the creation and dissemination of popular political symbols across a variety of visual sources, such as popular magazines, flyers, murals, paintings, etc. Many of these political battles included state-sponsored iconography, but in my dissertation, I focus on popular forms of representation, especially unions, social movements, and political parties. The outcome of these confrontations was a transformation of Argentine political discourse and the emergence of a new political language, a political language that still is present in everyday Argentine political discourse. So, I will start with a short story. This is a quote from a Peronist magazine from 1953 called Mundo Peronista, Peronist World. So, I will read just 3 lines. No monument anywhere in the world will be grander than the one to Eva Perón. It will have 137 meters and will be 46 meters taller than the Statue of Liberty, which is located at the entrance to the port of New York. Even though this gigantic statue was never finished, this project shows the importance of the relations between politics and representation in mid-20th century Argentina. So let's go directly to the chapter on Peronism. I will give you a brief historical context. Very brief. In June of 1943, a group of military officers, that include Juan Perón, took the power. Perón was in charge of what was then the Department of Labor, where he began a campaign in order to improve the conditions of Argentine working class. In October of 1945, Perón was put in prison, and that provoked a huge mobilization of the workers that demand his release. That was in October 17, a very famous Latin American moment. So, after 1946, Perón was elected as president, and he started a new economic policy, the so-called 5-year plan, Plan Quinquenal. So, he started the nationalization of the railroads, the water company, the telephone system, and he also started a new welfare program for workers and poor people. So now we can focus on the so-called Peronist political culture of the early 50s. So now you have the first slideshow. Very nice one. So, from the beginning of the 1950s, Peronism transformed the way that Argentine politics was conducted by giving a leading role to visual culture. The state took a central role in the production of images. The Bureau of Information, the so-called Subsecretaría de Informaciones, had been established in 1943, before Perón achieved power. So, this office played a key role during Perón's administration concerning visual production. So, the person who was in charge of this office was Raúl Apol. Okay? One of the goals of this office was the creation of flyers, popular images, and this kind of images of Perón, Evita, etc. So, the state has a central role in the organization and design of these images. I will start. I'm going to start this presentation with the representation of the political leaders, Perón and Evita. Perón represents here in this image the idea of the national and popular leader. Okay? If you can see the signs there says no intervention, social justice, warfare, etc. And justicialismo, which is the synonymous in order to refer to Peronism. So, let's go to the next slideshow. This is a very interesting one from the same magazine, which are all handed and created by the state. It's called PBT. These were all originals that I found in, of course, Museo Evita. I found a large amount of images, a small parenthesis, after 1955. All these kind of magazines were tried to destroy by the state. And I analyzed that in the next chapter of the dissertation. So it was very difficult to find this kind of cultural artifacts. They were hid by, clandestine Peronist groups. So after several years, because the 20 last years of democracy, we were able to have this kind of documents organized in archives. This is very important. Like 35 years ago, it was very difficult to lead this kind of research. End of the parenthesis. So, one of the Peronist principal innovation and historical watersheds was the personal relationship that established with its political followers. Using their images and political ritual, Peronism leaders sought to become an integral element of the Argentine people. Perón himself was often referred to as the first worker, as you can see in this image, and example of this mode of representation can be found in different kind of popular magazine like this one. He's dressed here as a worker. The character beside him is so-called Juan Pueblo, a typical representation of the worker. And this is the way that Peronism loves to portray the world of work, So I will go to the next one, and this encapsulates the different meanings and political ways that Peronism portrayed not only Perón, but Evita. Evita was able to articulate different political meanings. For instance, she was the spiritual leader of the nation, she was the mother of the nation, even that she never had any son or daughter, but she personified a number of female stereotypes. So we have to have in mind that Evita passed away in July of 1952. The personal story: my father arrived in Argentina in that day from Romania, and they say everybody speaks Romanian here, and he found that everybody was dressed in black, and so this is a very powerful moment. Evita image could be taken, for instance, here, representing the rural war, and this is a kind of paradox that you can see like a kolkhoz, like a very mechanized production, and this relates also to something called the Estatuto del Peón, which was a law that was created before Perón arrives to power, but due to Perón, which improved the condition of rural workers. Okay, so this, again, I found this in the Museo Evita. These were all official, popular production from the Peronist regime. So, let's go now to the most, for me, powerful image that I found also in Museo Evita. This was a very powerful moment because the librarian, he says, I'm going to give you something special. He opened a little box and he gave me the original. This is a stamp, like, from this side you can realize, but it's like this side, very small. Bless you. So here encapsulates, this is if you are familiar with the representation of the Madonna in the Renaissance art and in the typical Christian representation, here you have the sign of the cross, of course, and the whole spiritual symbols of Evita, the idea of the sainthood of Evita, which create a lot of troubles, especially with the Catholic Church, and in the year 1954. You have to have that in mind, especially when we are going to arrive to the end of Perón's regime. Okay, a very powerful image. If you go back, you see how many political meanings Evita is able to encapsulate. I have a lot of images that I can't bring to the presentation for the sake of time. So let's move now. Let's going to depart from the popular national leader to the canonization of the leaders of Peronism. In the final years, Perón's figure took almost a religious persona. After 1953, we see, for instance, a lot of representations of Perón start a sort of a gradual change. For instance, if we going back to this kind of powerful and colorful images of a smiling Perón, besides, hand-to-hand working with the people, these colors are going to be replaced by a completely different aesthetic, as you can see here. The government later projects, for instance, the monument that I said about Evita, and the idea of a memorial to Evita, were the building blocks of this new aesthetic that tried to establish a new legitimacy, paradoxically in a moment of political instability and a lot of internal troubles for Peronism. So, furthermore, we find that Perón, here, this is a very powerful images from Mundo Peronista. We found that Perón is more and more present in all the images, and again, the manner in which Perón is represented now shows all the signs of crystallization of power, rigidity, gravity, and a monochromatic style. There's no more the full colors, the bright and smiling. So more and more often, photographs showing these severe and emphatic gestures, and this is a very powerful one. The meaning of the dove is the Holy Spirit, and Salve Apostol. And if you are able, in the dissertation, I just copy all this poem, which is very powerful, and you can realize all the troubles that create with the Catholic Church. So let's go into the last momentum, or the last item in this way that Peronism represents the Argentine society. And these are the enemies of Peronism. And this is very important because historiography avoided the representations of the enemies of Peronism. There is the famous book on this topic is by Marcela Gené, which is an Argentinian historian, that she analyzed the representations of workers. And in one of the paragraphs, she says something that if you compare to the Nazi regime or the fascist or the interwar period in Europe, in Peronism, they were not representations on their enemies. We can make an opposite claim, especially with the research. Of course, we can't say that they were the same level and the same dehumanization that we found, for instance, in Nazis' cartoons or in Spanish Civil Wars cartoons against Republicans or communists. But what we have here is portrayed, again from Mundo Peronista, of what is considered to be the contra. What is the contra? Is all these elitist sectors which were against Peronism, and the image of the hammer represents the war of work. Again, Perón cumple, and a typical representation of a capitalist. Again, I don't know if what bring you this image to you. Can you associate it with another famous political poster? Okay. I'm going to make it quickly. Yeah. So, even that there were a whole rhetoric against communism, there is a circulation of ideas, of aesthetic, in mid-20th century, which is not only, of course, parentheses, the first thing that we have to have in mind is, of course, the Mexican Revolution, Vargas, but at the same time, we have to think in a global moment of political changes and instability. Of course, there are a lot of elements, Manifiesto, Bemberg, the US dollars, all the so-called enemies of Peronism. These were images that were circulating not only in 2 or 3 magazines, in all of them. So when we have to say that Peronism was not able to portray enemies, well, we can make a kind of different argument on that. So, I'm going to be finishing soon in order that we can have like questions, or we can move to, if you want, to different chapters. The conclusions are like Peronism revolutionized the way politics was conducted in Argentina by employing a number of visual and aesthetic media to carry its message. That transformation, which was part of a profound change in society, allowed to redraw all manner of social and political lines through the use of impossible to resolve political tensions. The figures of Juan and Eva Perón took a number of forms in the popular imagination, from that of the smiling leader who took on the burden of manual labor, to the female leader of the descamisados, the shirtless, to the saintly images that portray their final years in power. Similarly, the enemies of the people, let's see if I have here another one, the enemies of the people. This is a leader of the Socialist Party called Alfredo Palacios. The white hat is the Radical Party, which is not radical at all. It's a middle-class party. And in the middle you have the communist, So, the enemies of the people were defined in ways that took into account the new way of thinking about Peronism opponents, using visual media that sometimes led to them being metaphorically dehumanized. We have dogs here. It's a powerful image. It's for the first time we have this kind of political cartoons. At the same time, the use of visual media by the state expressed populist themes that incorporate cultural elements borrowed from the working class traditions. Peronism created a new vision of the people and their leaders. Their rituals and symbols were intended to represent a new Argentina. Complete with new provinces. We have to have in mind that 2 provinces will change their names to one province Juan Perón, the other one Eva Perón, when they were alive. So, the political meanings furnished by this new popular aesthetic were reshaped until the administration very end, moving toward a species of lay cult that competed directly, and this is a very important thing, with the Catholic Church. By June of 1955, the crisis that had begun with an open clash between Perón and the Church had reached its climax when the Navy bombed the Plaza de Mayo and killed more than 200 civilians. The reaction of Perón supporters to this incident was to burn down a number of churches, and it was in that precise moment that started the final crisis that ended with the coup d'etat of September of 1955. Perón ran away from the country. He went to Paraguay. But the legacy of these political battles and their symbols are still circulating today, as you can see here in this mural, which the inspiration was the one about Che Guevara in the Plaza of La Revolución in Havana. The artist is called Daniel Santoro. This is from 2001, and it was 15 years after Evita resigned for the vice presidency. So it was a lot of controversy about this building. This is in the middle of downtown Buenos Aires. Maybe with the picture you can realize the huge and the powerful and the political meaning to have this image today in the 21st century. So this is the end of the presentation. I have more images of and I can speak a little bit more if you want about the chapter, so we can open to questions. If you want. This is, I was talking before to Pablo that the next chapter is about the images against Peronism. This is a very powerful one. La Vanguardia was the socialist, a socialist publication, and this image was clandestine. This paper was closed by Perón in 1947, and from Uruguay, the socialists were creating images against Peronism. So here you have a very powerful, we were talking about female stereotypes. You have all the female stereotypes against Evita here. You see, like, I don't know how to say in English, the
rhoda.
Yeah, you have the rhoda there, the idea of the prostitute. So this was created at the same moment against, so this is another one. This is when Perón was, I found this in the Archivo General de la Nación, a very powerful image. I don't know if you can realize the images of Perón and Evita, and these smiling faces celebrating. So this is the other chapter on the Revolución Libertadora. So this is the other chapter that also I told to Pablo. These are clandestine newspapers from the Peronists. So we can start with the questions about the chapter that I presented. And thanks for your patience, and thank you.
Great. Well, I think there'll be quite a lot of interest in some of the other chapters, but maybe we can start with a round of questions on the chapter that you've presented. Would anyone like to start?
Alejandra.
I wonder if you trace, I mean, I have just seen these images, but have you traced any difference after Evita's death that might bring the issue, because death and deaf politicians and way politicians that die in Argentina is a recurrent topic. What have you seen about that, or what were the changes that the death of Evita brought, particularly to the aesthetics of that?
Yes. Well, absolutely. First point, the quantity of images are huge. Second, in terms of aesthetics, the multiplication of political meanings of Evita, not only in terms of aesthetic, but in terms of the possibilities that she was able to embody, changed a lot since 1952. But there is a sort of paradox. When we start to go to 1954, Perón is going to be more present and more present rather than Evita. There is a sort of paradox there. Okay, so in 1952, 1953, Evita is going to be circulating a lot, not only in visual, but in the radio. There is a typical story that everybody knows in Argentina, that every day, at the time was Evita passed away, in the radio was saying, it is the hour 8:15 is the moment that Evita passed away, every day. And this is a very important issue to bring, which is radio. It's not only visual, but Peronism was a revolution in terms of the use of mass media, the radio. Perón was a great orador, how do you say? Orator. He was a great orator. He was able, if you remember the first chapter of Daniel James, of Resistance and Integration, he portrayed how Perón was able to speak people's language, especially using tango metaphors, workers' metaphor. That was a watershed. Politicians before, especially socialists and Partido Radical, they were not able to speak in the same language of the new working class. So yes, I agree that there were a big and a huge change with her death. Yes.
Sorry, I missed the beginning, so I'm not sure what the other chapters are doing. But,
Yeah.
This chapter seems to be mainly about the aesthetic of these images, which are really fascinating.
Yeah.
But a couple of things.
Yeah.
I mean, just to clarify this, you make the case that there's a big change with Peronism. I'm wondering, did the radicals, did they use images at all? They must have used some paraphernalia, broadsheets, posters. Maybe they didn't. So I'm just wondering, sort of, whether it's a change in, surely a change in quantity of images circulating, but what the qualitative changes you see with earlier urban political movements. They must have used some sort of imagery.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering whether, in terms of the influences for these images, the one with the Soviet image is fascinating. I'm wondering whether there are sort of private consumer images that sort of feed into these as well. I'm thinking of the work of Eduardo Elena, who talks about consumerism and how that's bound up with Peronism. Are these borrowing from sort of adverts in the private sector as well? Is that feeding into these? And if so, how?
That's a very good point.
The questions I have are about the reception of these images.
Yes.
How you know they're powerful, I suppose, but maybe.
Yeah.
And why? Maybe one reason you know they're powerful is because lots of people kept them and stored them afterwards. I'm interested if you could talk a bit more about. Did they archive them? Did they sort of do anything with them? Did they just chuck them in the basement?
Yeah.
How were these all preserved?
Okay, I will start with the last point, which is fascinating. When you go to this one, to the moment of the resistance, and if you think the language, resistance, the resistance, the funny thing is like the anti-Peronists were saying themselves resistance against Peronism. And the Peronists, after 1955, they claimed that they were resistance too. So how they preserve these images? There is a fascinating testimony of an old woman that she hid in the garden a portrait of Evita. None of these images is this one. Is that the Evita that the common people like? The one that is portrayed as a fascinating porteña lady, not this one. This is a very paradoxical one. That I love it. Let me go. Yep. People in the 50s, they hate this one. But the so-called radicals and the youth of the 70s, they choose this one because it's the Evita which is able to work in a shanty town and to be a radical. So again, the different political meanings. Going back to your point, in the resistance, they hide these images because there were a decree, a law by the government saying that it's prohibited not only to have a picture of Evita, but even to mention Perón, to sing any song related with Perón or Evita. So I trace all of that, the official policy, not only destroying, and I was going to tell a little bit, but the policy that tried to replace Peronism using a so-called liberal, in a continental way, that, Republican, the idea of Argentina before Perón. So yeah, people were hiding these images. They were hiding, especially like magazines, small pictures. So first point. Second, I'm going in the reverse order. About Eduardo Elena, fascinating book about the consumerism and how Peronism. The title of the book is "Dignifying Argentina." It's a recent book. It comes like 2 years ago. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, which traces something that has been not very studied in Peronism, which is how the state start a new policy in terms not only of the idea of classical welfare state but how workers and poor people are able to consume, not in the same level like in America or in Europe, but if you compare with the 30s, in a very good way. So yes, advertising. Actually, Paul, this person that I mentioned to you was related with the so-called show business before. So it's not that the state is monolithic. Don't think in terms of Stalinism. This is a very complex moment. Actually, Peronism and the Peronist Party start in 1947. Before it was called, like here in England, the Labour Party. And in 46 and 47, Perón pushed away the labor sector, and he created first the Party of the National Revolution and then the Peronist Party. So yes, there were influences from private sectors and influences from so-called radicals who jump into the Peronist boat. So your first point was related to, I can't remember, your first question.
I'm just wondering what, sort of whether you've looked at uses of imagery,
before,
photography, what have you. I can imagine there's a huge quantitative change,
Yeah.
But I'm asking you to make the case for this being a big qualitative change in political imagery a bit more clearly by talking about how things worked before.
Yeah, that's the point. This was a watershed. Peronism was a before and after in the uses of images. For instance, the socialists, the so-called Partido Radical, they never use in this amount and with this political purpose visual images, especially posters. If you go to see the archives, you can find a lot of not only popular magazines but posters. I can't remember, but Mariano Plotkin has a book called Mañana y San Perón, and he has in a footnote something that they created, I don't know, like 3 million posters in those years, like a huge, you have to think in a society before the society of a spectacle. That television, the first portraying of an image in television was Evita. But television was a so-called luxury thing. But going back, Peronism was a watershed. Of course, before there were political cartoons. Of course, there were pamphlets. Of course, there were, different flyers. But for the first time, the state was using, and as I start the presentation with that, as in the same manner that they planify the economy, the Plan Quinquenal, the 5 years plan, they planify, of course, not in a perfect way, how they are going to use. And the dark side of this story is that they shut down a lot of newspapers. We have to have that in mind. Not only of the socialists, but for instance, of the so-called oligarchy or the elite, the Diario La Prensa, 1951. So it's not only the policy of creation, but repression too. For the first time, there were not that kind of cases before Peronism. The socialists were never shut down before. Thank you for your question.
Nicola?
Yes.
Hi. That was fascinating, thank you. I think I'm really sort of building or following on from what Tom was asking about. I think I'm still not quite clear what it is that the visual culture changes. I mean, I can accept, of course, Paradism takes over a lot of the mass media, that brings all sorts of changes, but a lot of the images you were showing us, which were absolutely fascinating, but they seem to play out the same disputes that we know about in the political discourse. So I'm wondering how the visual aspect of this culture, can you specify what is, you said it was revolutionary. What was revolutionary about the visual, aside from the fact that it's just more images?
You mean if you compare with the period before, or in a global context, comparing, I don't know, with Russia, or with if you think in terms of,
if you want to make the case of something being revolutionary,
yeah,
then you have to do both, perhaps.
No, yeah. It's for the first time they are using, again, all these images to create a national narrative. If you go, not only, this is a kind of schematic, cut that I made, but if you see all the images, not all of them, of course, but a large amount, you can see a meta-narrative of Argentina. All the time Peronism is portraying before and after. How were the conditions before of the workers? How were the conditions? And all of that is visual. Perón is able to talk a lot in the radio. He's able to have a lot of discourse in Plaza de Mayo. But all these magazines were able to portray, before the television, an historical narrative, a new Argentina, and this so-called representation of of workers, of leaders, that is something new. For instance, the radicales, they never portray this. Even Irigoyen, who was the famous so-called populist, he never tried to achieve this kind of organization of the way that you have to portray and represent Argentina. So in that way, I claim this is a watershed that still is used today in Argentina.
How does the circulation of those kind of magazines, how does that relate or how does it compare with attendance at all the speeches that the Peronists made? I mean, one of the main reasons they were so successful was that they were very present and people heard them, and you got that kind of sense of the spectacle being enacted around the country. So how are you sort of weighing up the significance of the magazines in relation to that kind of political gathering?
Yeah, well, there are two things. I agree, and you mentioned also the issue of circulation, and I forgot, and thank you, because that's a very interesting point. Okay, it's difficult to quantify the issue of circulation, and let's be frank, my dissertation is about production and the resignification of these images. So, on the topic of circulation, there are two things that I'm going to mention. The first one, that this is not only consuming in the private sphere. You have these images in all of the October 17. If you see the pictures in Mundo Peronista, I have my computer here, there is pictures of how were these Peronist rallies. So they were using, banners, they were using, the circulation of the images was also in the public sphere. Okay? So that's the first point. The second point, and I mentioned, what was your name? Tom. Yeah. To Tom, that you can see the legacy of these images when the Peronism was overthrown. So in order to quantify this in the period of Peronism, that's a good question. But what I can claim about is like the public sphere, the circulation in the public sphere, and the legacy of these images. So these are the 2 points. And again, I focus on the production and the resignification of these images, going back and forth. The next chapters, you can see, for instance, Juan Pueblo, how is portrayed by the socialist. If I have the time, I can show you how it's absolutely completely different. I'm following an anarchist tradition of how to represent labor. Labor as suffering, the worker is like this, and it's absolutely different than from this shiny, perfect teeth worker, which is absolutely, aesthetized. It's completely idealized by Peronism, it's a nice haircut, it's a kind of perfect worker. Yeah. Alejandra, yeah.
Well, if your concerns were about production, and I will insist on the last 2 questions, you make very strong claims about watershed, as being revolutionary, and other adjectives like that. But even you showed us comparable visual representations of even with different intentions. But we don't know 2 things. To what extent this is part of a broader phenomenon in which the technology of production and printing and so on allows for that probably wasn't available 20 years before, or even the nature of the media that conveys these things were not the ones that were available for the socialists and the radicales in the 1920s. And more importantly, have you seen any change throughout that? Because it's a period of time in which presumably was very intense production of this imaginary. But there change. That was my first question about the death of Eva. You perceive changes. How is transformed? Is it transformed? If there are differences in the way the state sort of imposes this, or the unions, can you establish differences within this period and depending on the agents that produce that? Because this seems like very shallow thing.
What is shallow, sorry?
Oh,
shallow.
Everything comes at once and it's all the same and it's huge, but it's kind of
no,
diachronic.
2 things. You have to have in mind that this is a kind of cut about Peronism. But the dissertation goes from 1950 to 1966. After 1955, you have a completely different change. I will start with your second point, which is first, the state has a completely different approach to the creation of images. It's, in terms of quantity, absolutely minor. In terms of the aesthetic, it's absolutely different. There is no representation of leaders. I was going to show more images, but for the sake of time, I organized a very brief presentation. But if you go to the images of post-1955, it's an absolutely different aesthetic. It's the portraying of liberty, of the Marianne, like in France. It's the same image, broken the changes. And in terms of your first point about technology, of course there is this idea of, and I quote Walter Benjamin in terms of the aesthetization of power, and claiming that for me was not only a change in terms of the capacity of the technology in order to create more images, but something different, which were the uses of the state of visual, a new visual economy. So for me, I claim that I'm not going to be like claiming that all the time that Peronism, but if you see that like the whole picture from 1950 to 1966, then you can see the diachronic and the changes and the dialectic.
Okay, there are several questions. One,
I don't know if that responded your question, Alejandra.
Here, and
Can I have a glass of water or something? or what? Thank you. Yeah.
Because I thought it was.
There was a question here first.
Yeah.
You just started to touch on this, but I was wondering about the art historical reference points that they're drawing on, because in the presentation it seems hugely varied. Each one seems really different. You've got the stamp, Eva Perón almost looks kind of draped in Byzantine drapery, and then there's the landscape, which looks like the late 19th century, early 20th century Argentine landscape paintings. There was the image of Perón almost looking like a Roman sculpture.
Yeah.
So I wondered whether they really are just drawing on the fullest toolbox of art historical references available, or whether actually there were kind of one or two strategic preferences, and also whether that changed over time.
Yeah, that's a good question. For instance, Mundo Peronista was part of a conglomerado, how you say that?
Conglomerate?
A conglomerate of several publications that before were, the owner was an English family, Haynes, I don't know how you pronounce that. So the changes that you can see in terms of aesthetic is part of a contradictory way of portraying Peronism. There is no kind of, mastermind creating, even that you have offices, you have a lot of contradictions inside the state and inside Peronism, which was not a political party but a movement. So in that sense, it's not like a direct, a linear moment between, the power of the state and the representation. There are a lot of ambiguities and a lot of contradictions. So, but you can trace, for me, a completely different momentum from this one of the early 50s. That was 1 year after the change of the reformation of the constitution in Argentina. In 1949, they changed the constitution in Argentina. Perón was able to be elected again as a president, and there was something else about visual that you mentioned. They changed to something called the Peronist doctrine, not only for the state but to the whole civil society. So in order to portray that, visual was key. I was not showing that here, but you can see a lot of changes in the way that the doctrine is portrayed in a very didactic way. And this is a society with a high level of literacy. When people is able to read, it's not like in Russia before the revolution. Like even the workers and a large amount of people is able to read. But, however, the didactic level of how they portray the political symbols and the idea of how to portray Peronism is there. So yes, you can see for me like this kind of changes from the early 50s to 1952, which is momentum, and when you go in closer to the end of Peronism, which is the moment for me of the crystallization of power, which has a completely particular aesthetic. Parenthesis, this is not a thesis on art history, and I'm not using a history of social images, but following Peter Brook, I think that images are documents, are like writing documents or oral history, so they are part of the documents that I use. Is not only visual documents that I use in the dissertation, but I use all kind of different, for instance, in the period of the resistance, I use tango lyrics in order to follow how was that moment. So I don't know if... And you have a question, Eduardo, no?
Yes. First of all, I think it's extremely interesting the point of view that you bring. But let me remind you of something. In the early 1940s, Roosevelt created a commission, an official body, who was in charge of promoting relations between the United States and Latin America. That included some artists of extremely high value, including immigrants from Europe for whom they couldn't find any other job, and musicians, and even Walt Disney produced a film that connects with this intention. That commission created in Argentina an immense impact in the artistic life. People learned an awful lot of what the Americans had developed in pictorial techniques for publications and this kind of stuff. Some of the pictures are very reminiscent to some of them, which I think is a point that deserves to be discussed.
Absolutely agree with you.
Finally, if you analyze the contents of a picture, very interesting too, because the worker has a mass. Perón has a little hammer. So, is that ironic or is just...
Yeah, well, it's open to all of you. I absolutely agree, Eduardo, and that's a very good point about Roosevelt. You were going to say something else, or no? And yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, the book that I dropped before from Marcela Genet, this Argentinian historian, she claims that there is a kind of stereotype that make equal Peronism with fascist aesthetic. She claimed the opposite. She says it was Roosevelt and this idea of, and this is very ambiguous, the relation of Peronism with capital. So the point is, it was Roosevelt and the idea of the New Deal, one of the biggest influence, not only in the relations between labor and capital in Argentina, but in terms of aesthetics. So thank you about your point. Absolutely, I agree with you. Yeah. She claims that, in her book, especially because she analyzed the representations of workers, rural workers, the typical labor, industrial workers, and women. That's her. It's a small book. It's a master thesis that it was published in 2006, I think, or something like that. It's in Spanish. I don't know if it has been translated in English, but and it has the same issue about the circulation that you mentioned before. It's a lot about production, but then you say, how is the issue of circulation? So that's a good point. I think there is another question. Someone else? Yes.
Wait. There's a...
you have a question.
More, excuse me, of a comment.
Yeah.
I pick up on all the other points, and the points that Alejandro made about the internal changes. But film directors, and you've shown us a little film, are told to show, not tell. And you have not shown us the points that you've been talking about, with the differentiation on either side of this sandwich. Yeah? Which is why I think, and I know half the people in the room, liberal, generous though they are, they don't believe you unless they have the evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah? And you haven't given it to us. So
I gave the paper.
what we need is not your chapter of your thesis, but the illustrations from the other chapters alongside it. 24 of them, you could still talk to now.
You want
8 on each section, yeah? Then I believe you, but we'll take it on trust in the meantime.
I have the computer here.
Yeah.
If when I can plug it in, it's an Apple. Hope is.
If you're going to show film, show, don't tell.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, I just organized this presentation for the sake of time without all the other images, but it's quite a long. If you want, I can send you all to the group if you want the images, and hope to publish the recommend.
They are great images, but for your argument, we need the other ones.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Tanya?
Hi, I was going to make the same point about what's happening from the US, but not necessarily just in terms of good neighbour and Roosevelt. I mean, World War II is the key thing, and when you said 1943 is when the Bureau of Information is established, that instantly went, wow, okay, Rockefeller's leading, head of coordinator of inter-American affairs at this moment, and it is a hugely funded cultural effort going on at that moment in time, not just to portray the good New Deal, but as I think you were mentioning, to also bring in Latin America in terms of the war effort, and that was what was so important. So I mean, it's that specific, situating it in that specific context, which really kind of just stood out at me and kind of chimed with what Alejandro was saying. Is what's changing in how production is happening with mass media, and in that line, I wondered, you didn't talk about newsreels.
Sorry?
Newsreels or film at all. Have you looked at that at all? Because that's part of the visual culture, and that's so important in terms of the changes that are going on in terms of communicating images and ideas with a mass audience in this period. The film industries are kind of growing and being hugely funded, particularly in this period.
Okay, two things. First, on your last point, I just do graphics, not films, because that's another dissertation. If you want to do that, just for Peronism, there is a whole thesis on that. It's called Cinema and Peronism. And if you go from 1950 to 1966, that's like 3 dissertations that you can write about. But I agree with you. Films is like key, especially Peronism use films and short films in order, again, to portray and to show, not to tell, following you, the news, and not only the news, but the changes in Argentina. First point, like films, is like my decision for the dissertation, and my advisor said to me, okay, you have to do only this, otherwise you go to a mental institution, because there are so many sources, and we go to mental institution for other reasons. If you go for research, Anyway, so for first point, and I love films, I would love it to do it, but anyway, going back.
Sorry, from the ones you've seen, is it the similar imagery that you're talking about? Was it? I know you haven't covered it in the dissertation, but are the same images of Juan Pueblo that you're describing here?
With films?
Yes.
That's a good point. About Juan Pueblo, I don't know. To be honest, I don't know if Juan Pueblo was portrayed in films. So we have to Google that. So second point, I'm always going back and forth. Your first point was about the U.S. and Peronism. I'm going to drop something obvious, the tensions between Argentina and the United States, not only with Perón, but before all the policy, international policy of neutrality. World War I, we were neutral. World War II, of course, and that was creating, big tensions. Before October 45, with the liberation of Paris, all the political spectrum, which was against the 1943 revolution, that Perón was in that sector, was waiting for the big change. Nobody, if you can read the memories of a famous Argentinian historian called Tulio Alperindongui, you know, he has a book, I don't know if it has been translated in English, it's in Spanish, you can read it, it's called Son Memorias. And he portrays almost day by day all those days before October 17. And everybody was waiting this big global change with the liberation of Paris and the end of something that they have seen as a regime closer to the Axis rather to the United States. So you know the famous story about the tensions between Perón and the ambassador of the United States, Braden, you know, and the slogan which galvanized the spirits is Brader or either Perón. So you have something there, but there is always but. By the end of Perón regime, Perón invites Eisenhower's brother to Argentina. And he promised that he was going to cut one of his arms before asking money to the United States, and whoops. So there is a lot of ambiguities there. And this is funny. Sorry, I'm going to tell, not to show. The portraying of one of the enemies is also communism. It's not only the United States, and Argentina want to be just in the middle. So no, I agree with the differences between the early Peronism and a post-war war, which is absolutely changing. You know that Argentina entered to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank after 1955. So it's a very complex moment. Yes?
My question was going back on the production side. And,
good.
The one that you're comfortable with. You mentioned how you're reading these as historical sources, which they are. And I want you to know more about the people who actually created them. You tend to say they, but you talk also about a very heterogeneous thing, Peronism. So are some of these state organized or others just people who like the Perons and do them things themselves? Is a kind of a very, you know, it seems like there's many things happening there, but we haven't really heard much of how these things get actually done.
Yeah, well,
let's not get into distributed, but just even done.
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the production, for instance, in Mundo Peronista, if you can see, there is no like actually artist who has signed these caricatures. They always have like nicknames, so you have to trace who are this day. You know, so it's very difficult. It's not like a bureaucratic, you know, obscure thing, but most of these artists, these are not like famous. I can drop like Argentinian artist names, but for the sake of the room, it's not necessary. But some of them, they were like a former socialist, former part of the Communist Party, that they start working for Peronism. These are this day, you know, these are not like famous artists. If you go to the next chapters, for instance, in my last chapters, I trace maybe two artists that you know. One is called Antonio Berni, and the other one is Ricardo Carpani, which are two painters. I was lucky to lead an interview to the widow of Ricardo Carpani, who portrayed murals for social movements, for unions. So then you have like days which were actually artists involved in so-called political and social struggles. But for Peronism, the day is like people who were actually working, not as gray, you know, employees, but people who were part of a vertical and official place. So it's difficult and tricky to think in terms of artists, in terms of a social sphere for this moment. After that, if you go to the social movements and unions, yes, you can see actually real artists who in the 70s were sent to exile. And they passed through a lot of, you know, typical things of Latin American artists and politicians and academics during the dictatorships. They were like people in exile too, in this period. Don't think that Peronism was just like, hanging all the people. No. There were people who were sent in a voluntary way. They went to exile in Uruguay, actually.
But following up on that question, is it possible to know if these representations were exclusively their own work, or were they working according to some kind of script that was handed to them? So for example, the shift that you note in the aesthetics towards this, kind of more Romanesque style, was that a decision taken by the individual artist, or is this coming out of some commission in the Peronist Party saying, look, from now on, this is how we're going to represent? So I guess the agency of the artist is what I'm after.
That's a very good question about the agency. Most of the time, like, artists are part of Peronism. To be honest, I don't have the document saying, this is the way that you have to portray Perón, by this color, by this side. I don't have that document. This is part of the uses of visual documents in a way, and that's a very interesting question in terms of, how was actually the canon of how to portray this? But the agency of the artist, no, there is no something called, there are ways of negotiation of the artist, but again, the idea of a public sphere in Peronism is complicated. But I don't have the document saying, this is the canon, this is the way, and it's tricky because, Peronism itself is very, the idea of how they were like using artists is very, very complex.
So just on that same point, but were these all just funded by the Peronists, be it by the state or by the party, or were there just other people who sprang out?
No, by the state.
Or it was all done by the state.
The state put the money in order to create all these publications. Mm-hmm. These are official publications.
Create or to publish them? I think
both.
Well, but that's something that Pablo was wondering. Or was the agency that there were some sort of, there was a canon, there was a suggestions, there was something that was top down, or there is a system that captures this and formalizes a canon, because the creation is one thing and the publication and the dissemination is not necessarily the same.
No, of course, but there is something called, like in newspapers, an editorial. You can't create anything you want. Of course, there is an amount of, let's say, agency of the artist. This is not a vertical moment, but there is an editorial line, like in newspapers, and even further. In Peronism, there is a political line that you have to follow. So, for me, it's both. It's creation and publication funding by the state. These are not publications of a so-called private, rich.
But unions, that doesn't necessarily make them the state, or local organizations or social movements.
Yeah, but
that's the differences I was wondering.
No, I agree with you in that sense, but you have to have in mind that the labor movement, even that they have a sort of capacity of negotiation with the Peronist state, as times goes by, they are even getting more and more and more tied to the decisions of the state. So it's a complicated moment. I'm not going to the direction to say this is a totalitarian state. Don't take me wrong, because it's not the point at all. Of course, there are, and the next chapter portrayed the counter images of Peronism, but the ambiguities and the contradictions inside Peronism are very difficult to trace. And again, we can discuss, but we need the documents in order to portray, for instance, this canon.
Yeah, but
Eduardo, yes.
That Pablo asked. I think you should keep in mind that
yeah.
Mundo Peronista, Mundo Atómico, Mundo y el mundo on top of that.
Yeah.
So it is an organized structure that is applied to different areas, sports, politics, science, everything. And it's very similar. If you read Mundo Atómico, for example, like I've been had a look recently, it's very similar to the Mundo Peronism, for example. It's the same structure that is applied to. So in that respect, it's organized. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, it's organized. But presumably there's no, I don't know, Goering coming up with a visual strategy in the way that you would expect.
The structure tells you.
I guess my query is whether, the artist kind of gets a sense of what he or she ought to be doing from the political moment, or whether, someone says, paint Evita this way rather than the way you painted her last year.
I mean, I'm coming up against a basic problem with writing. I'm comparing this with the sources that we have, say, about Mexico under the PRI in the 40s and 50s. There you have intelligence sources that we can now read, and we know that the Mexican government cared about what people made of its films and posters, and sent people to film studios and sent people into barrios and asked people, sat in cinema audiences and wrote up reports saying they liked this bit, they didn't like that bit, and it went up the chain. Those documents we don't have for Peronism, and we're never going to have them, I think, right? I mean, what are the government archives that are available to you from this period that you could find this kind of documents? I don't think that exists. No?
The problem with Argentina itself is all the political instability create direct cut and destruction of documents. Absolutely destruction. So I was struck, Eduardo, how you found, give me a second, Mundo Atómico, because in Museo Evita they have 2 copies. There is no something like, let's say, I've been in New York, something like the New York Library that you go and you have the complete collection of, no, even with newspapers. You know what happened when you have a coup d'etat? People go and they cut and destroy, for instance, the day of, I don't know, when Perón was overthrown. So archives are complicated on how to follow. You have to follow personal archives, you have to lead interviews, and you have to be lucky enough to have a librarian who has a good heart to open you a little box and show you these kind of images or this. I'm struck. I don't know if I can ask, if I can make questions myself, how you found Mundo Atómico. It's a very difficult one.
The Commission of Atomic Energy, there is the 4th copy.
Oh, wow. Good for you. In Buenos Aires. Yeah, because it's very, very difficult to find sources. Like one of the external reader of my dissertation, she say I can't say it, envidiosa. How do you say in a good way? Envious, because she wrote a biography of Evita, Marisa Navarro, and she told me, like 25 years ago, it was impossible to have all these documents organized in a place. So the issue of archives, not only on Peronism, but let's say the socialist one, this clandestine image of Evita was very, very difficult to trace. So, no, yeah, I agree with you, and there was... You were going to...
One quick question.
Yeah.
And a comment which you can stick away in a footnote somewhere.
Yeah.
Is there a Juan the worker before Perón? Is that like a popular phrase or figure?
Juan Pueblo?
Yeah, Juan del Pueblo.
Yeah. It
predates Perón, right?
It's a kind of master narrative.
Yeah. In Mexico, there's not a Juan del Pueblo, there's a Juan Soldado that everyone knows about. It's a poor, suffering conscript. He's the everyman. So, I don't know what that tells you, contrasting them. There are different Juans.
These are
maybe there's one in every country.
John Smith, these are master narratives, that you can trace all over, for instance, Latin America, So Juan Pueblo, again, is about talking about circulation. Juan Pueblo is resignified in different moments, even in the Resistencia Peronista, is portrayed in a completely different way. Not as a shiny, smiling Peronist worker, but absolutely different. But these are master narratives and archetypos. How you say archetypes? Archetypes. These are archetypes, like in the old Borges sense of archetypes. This is a labor archetype that you want to portray. And it's all the time a fighting on the social and political meaning, not only of the leaders, but this is key for the period of 1950-1966. Let's put a little bit aside Peronism because we get obsessed, with Perón. But the period of 1950-1966 is a key moment before the so-called 60s that everybody loves, and the 70s, and the guerrilla movement, and the union, and the youth. But this is a moment when the working class is a key actor in politics and in the representation of politics. So, who else has another question? And I will have.
Alejandro, you had a question?
Well, I'm Argentinian, and I'm growing tired to find Peronism inexplicable.
Me too.
And it's been far too long to ride on this exceptionalism, and I think it's lack of historical imagination, to be honest, and lack of comparative, or very Argentinian way, not to compare exceptionals. Now, the way that the state produces, disseminates some visual aesthetics of meaning, how does it change after Perón? How can this compare? And don't describe that, please. Yeah, the aesthetics, in which way they represent the same meaning now under a different political umbrella. That could be one way to explore that.
Yeah.
And also, what all these visual representations tells us about Peronism. You pointed at different representations of the enemies. I can't help but thinking how the present, representation of the enemies of the government represent the president, Cristina and so on. So if there was anything like this at the time, so that sort of comparison and reciprocal comparisons over time, if you don't want to compare with Mexico or with the Soviet Union or other countries, what happens for the state before and after Peronism as using these things? Because otherwise this is, inexplicable, and for me it's boring. Because you need to have like a good glass of Malbec to go over there.
Or something else. So, Scotch. Two things. The first one is like I claim in the introduction, actually making a comparison with the Mexican muralism and thinking about the influences not only of Latin America but global influence in terms of Russian Revolution and even Spanish Civil War momentum, and something which we never mentioned, which is the Catholic Church, which is key in representation. One point. The other point about the momentum after Peronism is not the state, but the market. Advertising, consumerism, especially when we think in post-1958 Frondizi and the influence of US media, there are a lot of portraying not only of workers but the middle class. Argentina as a middle class white country. That's key after 1958. The idea of the marketplace, advertising, and new way of portraying popular issues, popular themes. So there is a big change in this moment, not only of the state, but also of different interactions between the state, the marketplace, social movements, and political parties. I'm thinking in a global, and I completely agree with you. I'm sick and tired too of this kind of exceptionalism that could be Peronism or the Mexican Revolution. These are the two big champions, in Latin American idea of exceptionalism. No, and I absolutely agree with you in terms of we have to move beyond. And again, this is not a dissertation on Peronism. It's a dissertation on the political changes between an obscure moment that Argentinians who are obsessed with exceptionalism are obsessed with two things: Peronism and their origins, and the tragedy of the 1970s. I'm not feeling a kind of historical gap. I'm not thinking in terms of nobody has research, which is not true. A lot of people have research, but I'm thinking in a kind of new relationship between representation, politics, and popular culture. I don't know if that gives you a kind of answer or not.
Okay, well, I think maybe we should stop at this point. Juan Pablo, thank you very much for clearly a very stimulating presentation, and I hope to see this in print soon. And yeah, congratulations.
Thank you very much for your questions, your points. I was suggested to publish this as a book. I hope to work a lot, and this is going to improve a lot. I hope the chapters. Let's see. So let's see if the people in the empire will publish. I don't know which empire. The Argentinian and the Peronist.